How did one of Hollywood's most beloved stars manage to keep a secret so big it could have ended his entire career? For decades, Van Johnson was the face of clean-cut American charm, the red-haired heartthrob of the silver screen. But behind the camera, he was living a life that no one dared speak about. Studio executives protected him. The press turned a blind eye, and even his marriage was a lie. It's been whispered in Hollywood circles for years. Van Johnson didn't just have a hidden personal life, he was allegedly involved with multiple male actors in a single night. 8 of them, to be exact. Was it just a rumor? An exaggeration? Or was the truth far more complicated and tragic than anyone was ready to admit? This is the story of the man who built a career on charm, but lived behind a mask, a story Hollywood tried to erase. Long before the whispers and the studio lights, Van Johnson was just a lonely kid from Newport, Rhode Island. Born in 1916 to a cold, distant father and a mother who walked out when he was still a child, Van grew up craving connection, something he'd spend his whole life chasing. He wasn't the kind of boy you'd expect to become a Hollywood star. Quiet, introspective, and awkward in crowds, Van found comfort in music and fantasy. By the time he was a teenager, he'd set his sights on something far bigger than Rhode Island: show business. With barely $1 to his name, he moved to New York City and threw himself into the chaotic world of vaudeville and nightclubs. He worked odd jobs, played in jazz bands, danced in smoky lounges, and waited tables, anything to get closer to the stage. And then, something clicked. His charm wasn't loud, but it was magnetic. He had a natural rhythm, a boyish innocence, and just enough mystery to catch the attention of Broadway producers. Small roles led to bigger ones, and soon, Hollywood came calling. MGM, the most powerful studio in the business, signed him at the perfect time, and from there, the transformation began. But as his star rose on screen, the studio began rewriting his story off-screen, and Van had no choice but to play along. By the early 1940s, Van Johnson wasn't just another actor, he was the face of wartime America. While other stars were drafted into combat, Van stayed home, not by choice, but by circumstance. A brutal car accident in 1943 left him with a metal plate in his skull and permanently off the battlefield. But MGM saw an opportunity. With its biggest male stars off fighting, the studio doubled down on Johnson's boy-next-door appeal. Freckles, red hair. A constant smile, Van was cast as the clean-cut soldier, the sweet hometown boyfriend, the guy every mother adored and every daughter secretly fantasized about. Movies like A Guy Named Joe and 30 Seconds Over Tokyo turned him into a symbol of hope. Teenage girls plastered his face on their bedroom walls. The press called him the Bobby Soxer's idol. And the studio? They saw dollar signs and control. Everything about Van's image was meticulously crafted. His public appearances were scripted, his interviews rehearsed. There were no outbursts, no scandals, no surprises, just the all-American golden boy. But behind that carefully polished surface was a man growing tired of pretending and secrets that could never be written into a movie script. And soon, MGM would take drastic steps to keep those secrets buried, no matter the cost. In 1947, Van Johnson shocked Hollywood by marrying actress Eve Abbott just one day after her divorce from fellow actor Keenan Wynn was finalized. The timing was suspicious. The match? Even more so. Eve had been part of the Hollywood social circuit for years, elegant, intelligent, and already tangled in a complicated web of relationships. Her ex-husband, Keenan, was not just a colleague of Van's, he was one of his closest friends. The three of them had spent years in the same circles, and their closeness raised more than a few eyebrows. But beneath the surface, this wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was a cover story. According to Eve herself in a bombshell statement released years later, the marriage had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. She claimed that MGM executives, led by the infamous Louis B. Mayer, arranged the entire union to squash growing rumors about Van's sexuality. They needed their big star to be married, she said. Unfortunately, I was the only woman he would agree to marry. It wasn't just gossip, the studio feared it was collapse. In the rigid, image-obsessed world of 1940s, Hollywood, being labeled gay, could destroy a career overnight. MGM had spent years and millions crafting Van's reputation. A single scandal could bring it all crashing down. So they staged a wedding. On the outside, the Johnsons appeared to be the perfect Hollywood family. They had a daughter together. Van took on a fatherly role to Eve's two sons. Red carpet photos, cheerful interviews, happy home life. But behind the smiles was a silent agreement, a marriage built not on love, but on necessity. And beneath that agreement simmered something even messier. A secret triangle of affection, obligation, and unspoken desire. For years, Van Johnson played his part husband, father, icon. But Hollywood's most carefully constructed images often hide the darkest truths. Whispers had always followed him. Industry insiders talked in hushed tones about private parties in Beverly Hills, secret rendezvous on studio lots, and a growing list of male lovers hidden behind studio gates. According to some, Van wasn't just quietly exploring his identity, he was indulging in it heavily. One story, passed around like a myth among old-school Hollywood circles, claimed that Van once bragged about spending a single night with 8 male actors one after the other. Was it real? Exaggerated? Maybe. But in the coded world of closeted stars, even the rumor was electric. And the names that surfaced? They weren't just anyone. They included Roddy McDowall, Farley Granger, Clifton Webb, and even a young Rock Hudson, whose own secrets would only come to light decades later. These weren't just flings, they were whispered alliances in an era that forced men like them to hide in plain sight. Van became a regular at hidden parties in Laurel Canyon and gated estates in the hills, where the rules of the outside world didn't apply. These gatherings were sanctuaries, temporary escapes from the cameras, the contracts, the constant performance of normal. MGM knew. Of course they knew. And instead of helping, they tightened their grip. Van's public appearances were monitored. Tabloids were paid off. Fellow actors were warned to keep their distance unless they played along. Behind the scenes, Van was walking a razor's edge, adored by millions, but never allowed to be himself. But it wouldn't be a Hollywood scandal without a twist, and that twist came in the form of a dancer, thousands of miles from Hollywood. By the late 1950s, the cracks in Van Johnson's carefully curated image were no longer easy to hide. His marriage had become little more than a silent agreement, and his real life, the one far away from flashing cameras and studio sets, was pulling him in a different direction. The breaking point came not in Hollywood, but in London. While starring in a West End production of The Music Man, Van reportedly began a passionate relationship with a young male dancer from the cast. It wasn't just another hidden affair, this one meant something. It was open, emotional, and reckless by old Hollywood standards. He didn't just fall into the arms of another man. He left his family for him. According to Eve's son, Ned Wynn, Van left her for a man. A boy, really. The dancer was young, bold, and unafraid, everything Van had never been allowed to be. For the first time, he didn't hide. He stopped pretending. The studio couldn't protect him anymore. Mayer was gone. The old system was unraveling, and with it, so was Van's carefully preserved persona. The marriage ended in slow motion. Van and Eve separated in 1961, but the divorce wasn't finalized until 1968, dragged out over years of silence, resentment, and distance. Publicly, they remained civil. Privately, they were strangers. And with the collapse of his marriage came the collapse of the illusion. The all-American boy with the easy smile had finally dropped the mask, and what emerged wasn't scandalous. It was simply human. But while the world still saw a polished star, those closest to Van knew something deeper was unraveling, and it went far beyond just failed love. Behind the fame, behind the scandal, Van Johnson was a man carrying damage that no studio could polish away. The pain didn't start in Hollywood, it started long before the red carpets and marquee lights. Van had grown up in a house where affection was rare and expectations were high. His mother left when he was a child, vanishing from his life without explanation. His father, cold and controlling, demanded perfection but offered no warmth. That abandonment, that emotional starvation, never left him. Eve, in later interviews, painted a portrait of a man who was nothing like his sunny on-screen roles. Behind closed doors, Van was quiet, withdrawn, often melancholic, sometimes unreachable. When conflict arose, he didn't argue. He disappeared. He would lock himself away in his bedroom for hours, sometimes days, refusing to speak, refusing to engage. This wasn't arrogance. It was fragility, a fear of confrontation so deep, it controlled him. Friends described him as gentle, but guarded, loving, but unreachable. Even with his daughter, Skylar, the connection frayed over the years. By the time he passed away in 2008, the two were reportedly estranged. The same man who once made millions feel seen and loved on screen had slowly become a stranger to his own child. And yet, maybe that's the saddest part of Van Johnson's story. He gave the world warmth he never truly received himself. And as the bright lights of Hollywood began to fade, Van chose solitude over spectacle, retreating into a final act that was as quiet as his pain. As the studio system that once controlled his life crumbled, so did Van Johnson's presence in the public eye. He didn't go out with scandal or spectacle. He simply stepped away the way he had always handled pain. In the early 1990s, after nearly 5 decades of performing, Van quietly retired from show business. No farewell tour, no grand interviews. Just a soft exit, almost like he was slipping into the background of a scene he no longer belonged in. He settled in New York City, living alone in a modest penthouse on Manhattan's East Side. From the windows, he could see the East River, a far cry from the studios of Hollywood, but peaceful. Occasionally, a fan would spot him on the street or in the elevator, surprised to find the once glowing star now quietly keeping to himself. As his health declined, he moved to an assisted living facility in Nyack, New York, a quiet town known for its art scene and its silence. It was the kind of place where no one asked too many questions, and Van seemed to prefer it that way. He passed away there on the 12th of December, 2008, at the age of 92. There was no media circus, no red carpet tribute, no final spotlight. His death was as private as his pain had been a soft ending to a life that had been lived under hard scrutiny. He was cremated, according to public records. And although he had no close family at his side, his legacy lived on not just in the dozens of films he left behind, but in the memory of an era and in the hearts of fans who never saw the sadness behind his smile. Van Johnson was once the boy next door to an entire nation, but behind that familiar face was a man shaped by loneliness, defined by secrecy, and remembered by a world that never truly knew him. But maybe that's what makes his story unforgettable, not just what he gave the world, but everything he had to hide to give it. Van Johnson's life was a performance that never ended, even when the cameras stopped rolling. He was the embodiment of Hollywood's golden age, polished, charming, dependable, but behind the roles, behind the rehearsed smiles and studio-controlled interviews, was a man forced to live a double life. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. In an industry built on illusion, Van's entire existence became a balancing act. His marriage was arranged, his truth was denied. His pain was hidden behind song and dance numbers and wartime speeches that made audiences cheer. He was adored by millions, but truly known by few. The story of Van Johnson isn't just about fame or scandal. It's about survival, about what it cost to fit the mold and what it meant to break it, quietly in his own way. He didn't burn out in a blaze of controversy. He faded gracefully, privately, but not without leaving behind a powerful truth: that some of Hollywood's brightest stars were shining through unbearable darkness. So when we remember Van Johnson, maybe it shouldn't just be for the movies or the music or the smile. Maybe it should be for the silence he carried and the courage it took to keep going anyway.